On the night of February 27th, a 1,000-pound English aerial bomb dropped on Gneiseno, penetrated the upper deck and exploded on the armor deck near the Anton turret. A powerful explosion of the turret's ammunition followed, as a result of which the ship was heavily damaged, 112 people were killed and 21 were wounded. Although it was possible to restore the ship as a combat unit, the cost of restoration was enormous, and the state of German industry, the threat of constant air raids, and the need for metal in other areas of industry put an end to this project. Gneiseno left her twin sister alone. Scharnhorst was lucky in kill, although she also suffered minor damage during another raid, and they were killed and wounded on board. On April 1st, Friedrich Hufmeier was appointed as the ship's commander. The ship was supposed to be put in dry dock for 10 weeks, and then spent another 3 weeks completing repairs afloat. But due to the air threat, the floating dock where Scharnhorst was being repaired was towed to Kiel Bay and kept there until the air defense of the base was reinforced with additional anti-aircraft guns and fighters. This delayed the repair works, and the ship was taken out of the dry dock only on June 16th and prepared for trials in July. After their completion, Scharnhorst spent several more days in Kiel. On 16th August, Scharnhorst left for Gotenhafen under escort for training and exercises. A month later, during training with submarines, she collided with U-523. Although the damage was not serious, the ship had to be put into dry dock for several days. At the end of October, the rudder was replaced. The new design took into account the experience of damage from the torpedoes on Lutzow and Prince Eugen. Problems with the boilers and turbines prevented the ship from moving to Norway during 1942. In December, Scharnhorst had only 2 operating shafts and could not produce more than 25 knots. Therefore, she was prescribed a major overhaul of the machinery. Already in January 1943, the tests were considered satisfactory, and the ship herself was ready for transfer to Norway. On 7th January, Scharnhorst, Prince Eugen and 5 destroyers left for Norway. But after activity was detected at airfields all along the coast of England and Scotland, the group came back on January 11th. By this time, the British had managed to crack the German codes using the ultra-decryption machine and intercepted a message about the dispatch of Scharnhorst to Norway. The Admiralty ordered the Coastal Command to take measures to attack the German ships. On January 23rd, Scharnhorst was again returned from the passage for the same reason, and during preparations for the third exit on February 10th, she ran aground while trying to avoid a collision with a submarine. While the hull was being patched, the leadership discussed the future of Scharnhorst in light of the Führer's decision to disable all large ships. Admirals Dönitz and Schneewind believed that she should still be sent to Norway, where she and Tirpitz would form a powerful squadron, which would not only have an impact on the enemy, but would also raise the morale of the Kriegsmarine personnel. Scharnhorst could return together with Tirpitz in September or October, which would allow saving fuel and the number of escort ships involved. This point of view was successfully defended, but it was necessary to sacrifice the cruiser Prince Eugen, which was transferred to the training squadron in the Baltic before the planned time. On 8th March, Scharnhorst, accompanied by 4 destroyers, left Gotenhafen for Norway. While in the Norwegian Sea off Bergen, the ships encountered a severe storm on 11th March, forcing the destroyers to seek refuge in the fjords. Scharnhorst continued on her way alone, initially at 17 knots, and after the storm had somewhat abated, at 28 knots. The side gun mounts were slightly damaged. However, the bad weather protected the ship from British aircrafts. At 4 p.m. on 14th March, the battlecruiser dropped anchor in Bogen Bay near Narvik, and on 22nd March, together with Tirpitz and Lutzow, she moved to Altenfjord, where she underwent repairs of the storm damage. In early April, Scharnhorst and Tirpitz conducted various exercises in the Arctic Ocean, and together with 9 destroyers, made a voyage to Bear Island. For almost 6 months, Scharnhorst was practically inactive, except for short exercises. The activity of the fleet was seriously limited by the lack of fuel. Nevertheless, the presence of such a powerful German squadron in Norway did not allow the British to resume escorting convoys to USSR until the Pearl Night began. In addition, the Germans managed to hide from the enemy the fact that most of the attacked air squadrons had already been transferred to the Eastern Front. In June 1943, the British and Norwegians captured the German weather station on Spitsbergen, and over the summer, the Germans prepared a response with Tirpitz and Scharnhorst. Although such a force seemed excessive, it was a rare opportunity to practice the cooperation of the two largest ships of the Kriegsmarine and to boost the morale of the personnel during a long period of inactivity. On September 8th, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and 10 destroyers bombarded the coastal installations on Spitsbergen, suppressing a battery of two 76mm guns with some salvo. The battleships fired at buildings, coal mines, fuel tanks, battery construction sites, and burden facilities. A German landing force of 1,000 men landed on the shore, but the Norwegian garrison on the island managed to retreat into the mountains. At 11 a.m., Scharnhorst completed her mission. Her shooting in this operation was so atrocious that Captain Hufmeier immediately took his ship out to sea for gunnery exercises upon returning to base. While Scharnhorst was learning to fire, the British carried out an operation to attack the base with X-class midget submarines. On September 22nd, the midgets attacked Tirpitz, moored in the fjord, damaging her engines and putting her out of action for a long time. Two boats were supposed to attack Scharnhorst, but she was not at her regular anchorage. After the damage to Tirpitz and the departure of Lutzow on September 23rd for scheduled repairs, the active core of the German fleet in the Arctic was reduced to Scharnhorst, 6 destroyers of the 4th Flotilla, and 24 submarines. In the second half of 1943, the situation of the German army in USSR became critical. Since the threat from the German squadron had significantly diminished, the British Admiralty, yielding to the persistent demands of their Russian allies, agreed to resume the escort of convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Remembering the sad experience of 1942, the British abandoned large convoys of 40 ships and began to divide them in two. The new cycle began on November 1st with the dispatch of 13 empty ships from Arkhangelsk, and in a month and a half they managed to conduct 3 eastern convoys and 2 western ones without losses. The convoys were accompanied by an escort of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, which were joined by local escorts at the final section of the route. In the most dangerous section, south of the Bear Island, they were accompanied by a close cover of cruisers. A distant cover, including a battleship, patrolled from 10 miles east to 200 miles northwest of the island, covering both convoys at once, which met in this area. On December 19th, at a meeting with Hitler, the commander-in-chief of the fleet, Admiral Dönitz, reported that Scharnhorst and the 4th Flotilla would attack the next convoy. After 2 days of discussion, Hitler authorized this operation, giving the surface ships a last chance to prove themselves. The temporary commander of the strike force, Rear Admiral Erich Bay, received an order from Dönitz on December 22nd to go on 3-hour readiness. For the commander of Scharnhorst, Fritz Hintze, this was the first time he went to sea in his new position. On the morning of December 25th, the German submarine U-601 and the Dornier Do-18 aircraft obtained the exact coordinates of 2 Arctic convoys, JW-55B and RA-55A. Convoy JW, consisting of 19 transports and tankers, left on December 20th under the protection of 10 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and 3 minesweepers. Convoy RA, escorted by 10 destroyers, 3 corvettes, and a minesweeper, set out to meet it. In the Barents Sea, Both convoys were covered by Formation 1, consisting of the cruisers Belfast, Sheffield and Norfolk. Formation 2, consisting of the battleship Duke of York, the cruiser Jamaica and 4 destroyers, was supposed to cover JW and then return, covering Array. After a German submarine reported the exact coordinates of the convoy, Admiral Dönitz ordered an interception. British intelligence was able to intercept and decipher the order. Ostfront, Scharnhorst should put to sea on the 25th at 5 p.m. British Admiral Fraser and the distant cover formation that left Iceland on December 23rd were ordered to prepare for action to cut off the German battleship's path back to Norway. Admiral Bay planned to attack the convoy at about 10 a.m. on December 26th if the weather and visibility were favorable and the information about the enemy forces was correct. With only 6 hours of twilight and only 45 minutes of daylight, the battle had to be carried out very quickly. The German formation, Scharnhorst and 5 destroyers, put to sea at about 7 p.m. and at 11 p.m. the Norwegian coast over the horizon disappeared. On the morning of December 26th, the Fleet Command conveyed to Bay the decision of the German Admiralty to return the destroyers in the event of worsening weather and actions of Scharnhorst alone. At 7 a.m., the German group, located 40 miles southwest of Bear Island, turned toward the point where, according to calculations, a meeting with the convoy was to take place in the morning twilight. The destroyers were searching 10 miles southwest of Scharnhorst. The crews were in a state of full combat readiness from 3 a.m. The destroyers had a hard time in the stormy sea, and their speed had to be reduced to 10 knots. At 8:40 a.m., the radar of the light cruiser Belfast detected Scharnhorst from a distance of 33 kilometers. The cover ship sounded the alarm, and 3 British cruisers of the 10th Squadron of Vice Admiral Burnett began to approach the enemy. Scharnhorst was not yet aware of the presence of the British ships, as for greater secrecy she did not switch on her radar. At 9:20 a.m., the signalman of the cruiser Sheffield spotted the German ship from a distance of 11 kilometers, and 3 minutes later, Belfast opened fire with elimination shells from a distance of 8.6 kilometers. Norfolk opened fire immediately after. 6 full broadsides were fired in 9 minutes. The first salvo from the cruiser Norfolk landed just 500 meters from the side of Scharnhorst, which responded with a salvo from the Caesar turret, and then began to retreat at a speed of 30 knots. The British used artillery radars, and in this they were superior to the enemy, who had an advantage in speed and gun power. During the 20-minute exchange of fire, 3 203mm shells hit Scharnhorst. The first hit the upper deck from the left side, between the deck 150mm mount and the torpedo tube, and without exploding, passed into the forecastle or the watertight compartment. A small fire that started there was quickly extinguished. A few minutes later, another shell hit the bow rangefinders and showered the anti-aircraft artillery crew with shrapnel. The antenna of the bow radar was destroyed, and fragments penetrated into the cabin of the receiving radar station, killing all personnel there. The ship was blinded from the bow angles, since the stern radar, located below the bow, had a limited forward angles. The third shell hit the forecastle and exploded. Trying to leave the battle, Scharnhorst changed course several times. At 9:55 a.m., Admiral Bay radioed about the battle with the British cruisers, but a few minutes later he was able to break away from the enemy, which in the stormy sea could not give more than 24 knots. Having an advantage of 4 to 6 knots, Scharnhorst quickly increased the distance from the pursuers. Having broken away from the cruisers, Scharnhorst again began searching for the convoy, and by 12 o'clock had reached the northeast of it. 5 minutes later, Belfast regained radar contact with the Germans, but it was not until 12:21 that the British cruisers were able to close the distance. At this point, Scharnhorst detected them with her stern radar and then visually. The British fired elimination shells, but the battle cruiser quickly opened fire from her bow turrets and again changed course to the northwest, bringing the stern turret into action. The stern prevented the British destroyers from launching a torpedo attack. At 12:23, Norfolk was hit in the area of her stern funnel. A few seconds later, a second shell hit the barbette of her X turret, putting it out of action. To prevent an explosion, the turret magazine had to be flooded. The first hit was more serious. The shell penetrated the superstructure from the starboard side and exploded right next to the port side plating, tearing it apart over a large area. The shrapnel completely disabled the radar installation, after which the cruiser was unable to maintain accurate fire. There were 7 killed and 5 wounded. Turret B fired 4 more salvos using the old data, and then Norfolk temporarily ceased fire. A few minutes later, Sheffield was showered with large fragments. The situation began to look bad for the British. After all, Scharnhorst was much stronger than the 3 cruisers, but Admiral Bay changed course and increased speed. He did not want to continue the fight with the cruisers. His goal was the convoy. After this phase of the battle, Admiral Fraser's ships approached from the southwest. The battleship Duke of York, the cruiser Jamaica, and 4 destroyers. And Burnet's cruisers continued to stay outside the fire range of Scharnhorst, maintaining radar contact and reporting the enemy's coordinates to their battleship. The German destroyers saw the elimination shells that the British cruisers fired during the morning battle, but they were far from Scharnhorst. Admiral Bay ordered them to go northeast to join the flagship, but at midday he again sent them west to search for the convoy. After this, there was no more tactical interaction between Scharnhorst and the German destroyers. Around 1 p.m., the destroyers, without knowing it, passed only 15 kilometers south of the convoy. Finally, at 1:43, Admiral Bay ordered them to stop searching and return to base. The next day, around 10 a.m., they returned to Kara Fjord. Their absence in the final phase of the battle proved fatal for Scharnhorst. After all, after her bow radar had failed, the destroyers could have detected the enemy in advance, helped the flagship repel torpedo attacks, and they themselves would have posed a serious threat to the British ships with their 150mm guns and 8 torpedo tubes. Around 1:15 p.m., Admiral Bay decided to return to base, not expecting any more skirmishes. The ship's crew, which had not been fed since early morning, began to have lunch, but remained in combat readiness. The aft radar was switched off so as not to reveal the ship by its operation. At 3:25, Bay radioed the headquarters of the North Group the expected time of his return. He did not know that he was heading exactly to intersect the course of Admiral Fraser, who was receiving his coordinates from the cruisers. With the bow radar destroyed and the aft radar switched off, Scharnhorst was heading straight into a trap from which there was no escape. At 7.5 miles behind, like a pack of hounds, in a closed front line, were Burnet's cruisers. This peculiar chase lasted more than 3 hours. There was a moment that could have changed the situation when Norfolk slowed down to put out the fire, and then Sheffield slowed down due to a breakdown. But already at 4:17, the British battleship's search radar detected the enemy at a distance of 22 miles. The death sentence of Scharnhorst was signed. Fraser ordered that tracking be continued until the ships were within effective firing range. When the shell exploded in the sky, the British were surprised to find that the main caliber turrets on Scharnhorst were deployed in their marching position. A minute later, Duke of York began firing salvos from a distance of 11 kilometers. At 4:50, the cruiser Jamaica joined her. Although Scharnhorst was taken by surprise, she quickly returned fire, and without a moment's hesitation, trod north. The duel between her and the battleship Duke of York was unequal. The German 283mm shells could not penetrate the thick armor, protecting the vital parts of the British battleship. At 4:55, a 356mm shell from the first salvo hit the starboard side of Scharnhorst opposite the Anton turret. The turret jammed with its guns raised, and the horizontal and vertical aiming drives failed. A fire started in the magazines from the hot shrapnel, and the shrapnel also pierced the door to the Brunner turret's magazines. The magazines of both turrets had to be flooded, but they were drained under the Brunner turret so quickly that it had almost no effect on its rate of fire. The fleet crew worked waist deep in icy water, trying to save at least some of the ammunition. Despite the damage, the ship maintained high speed. The second shell damaged the ventilation duct of the Brunner turret, which is why its fighting compartment was filled with gases and smoke after each opening of the gun breech. Another shell hit near the scissor turret and pierced the battery deck. The hole was quickly patched up, but the compartments where the shell had exploded were flooded and not drained. Shrapnel riddled two planes and destroyed several anti-aircraft guns, killing most of their crews. After this, Captain Hitze ordered the survivors to take cover. These hits did not pose a threat to Scharnhorst. The main thing was that she maintained her speed advantage and began to break away from the enemy. Only the destroyer Savage was able to follow, which the Germans could not shake off from their tail, although the shells fell only 20 meters from her. The destroyer came so close that she was forced to turn away, never having received an order for a torpedo attack. At 5:30, 356mm shells hit both Bo 150mm turrets. The right one was completely destroyed, killing all the people in the turret and on the feed, and the left one jammed. But after 10 minutes, it was completely out of action. A shell that hit the forecastle tore the chain of the right anchor, which fell into the sea with the remains of the chain. Soon, the same thing happened to the bow anchor. At 5:40, due to the increased distance, Jamaica ceased firing, and only Fraser's flagship continued to methodically fire salvos at the retreating Scharnhorst. Fortunately for the British, the shooting of Duke of York was accurate. The gun turrets on the German ship were failing one after another. Fragments of heavy shells penetrated even into the sailors, knocking out the crew working on the feed. And around 6 p.m., a shell hit the starboard side, exploding in boiler room number 1. At first, the crew thought the ship had been hit by a torpedo, so powerful was the impact and explosion. The ship's speed dropped to 8 knots. Emergency measures were taken quickly and effectively, but when the watertight doors and hatches were battened down, 25 people were trapped in the boiler room. The steam pressure was increased, and the chief engineer reported to the bridge, "I can give 22 knots." To which the ship's commander, Hintze, replied, "Bravo, keep it up." These words raised the weakened spirit of the German sailors. They remembered the fate of Bismarck and knew that they would hardly return home alive. But seeing the confidence of their commander, they, like their brothers from the battleship, began to fulfill their duty with fierce zeal, if not to Hitler, then to the country they served. Scharnhorst fired from a distance of 15 to 20 kilometers and covered Duke of York with several salvos, showering her side with shrapnel, and a direct hit to the foremast blew one of her supports overboard and temporarily disabled the artillery radar. Lieutenant Bates climbed the mast, managed to repair the broken cable between the antenna and the radar screen, and the fire continued with the same efficiency. The remaining damage on the English battleship turned out to be from her own fire. The artillery duel had already lasted almost 90 minutes, and Scharnhorst had sustained significant damage. Her superstructure was pierced by shrapnel in many places, and in some places it was destroyed by direct hits. Fires broke out, sometimes accompanied by explosions. Under these conditions, the crew continued to do their job skillfully and calmly. The fire in the hangar, which destroyed 2 seaplanes, was extinguished after 10 minutes, but an attempt to launch the remaining aircraft from a catapult failed. Almost all of the artillery mounts and the port torpedo tube were destroyed or disabled. The torpedo officer, under heavy fire, bravely rushed to the port torpedo tube before the latter was disabled. He was able to turn the tube around and fire 2 torpedoes, but the third one jammed in the tube. According to eyewitnesses, the officer was killed by shrapnel from a shell that exploded nearby, or by a shell that hit a jammed torpedo which detonated in the apparatus. The surviving crew was ordered to take cover and fight the fires. Rear Admiral Bay now knew for sure that he was cornered, and at 6:24 he ordered the last radiogram to be sent to Hitler and his homeland. "We will fight to the last shell." At 6:42, Duke of York ceased fire after firing 52 salvos, 31 of which covered the target and had scored at least 13 direct hits. These shells, and those from the cruisers, had killed and wounded many men on Scharnhorst and disabled most of the 150mm guns. However, Scharnhorst still maintained high speed, and Admiral Fraser, fearing that the enemy might escape, ordered the destroyers to launch a torpedo attack. Fraser radioed Barnett at Belfast. No hope of overtaking Scharnhorst, intending to go over to cover the convoy. But the luck has run out for the Germans, and this was noticed in the chat room. The ships began to close the distance. Then Fraser cancelled his last order and decided to go straight for Scharnhorst. Due to the drop in speed of Scharnhorst, the destroyer Scorpion and Stord managed to get within 6 miles distance. The German ship no longer had the means to repel such attacks, which allowed the destroyers to approach torpedo launching range with almost no resistance. Around 6:50, Stord and Scorpion, being on both of their victims' bulwarks, fired 8 torpedoes each from distance of 16 and 1900 meters. Scharnhorst turned sharply to the right, but 3 torpedoes still reached their target. With this turn, she exposed her side to the destroyers Savage and Somers. The first fired 8 torpedoes, and the second, having approached to 1600 meters, came under fire from the few small guns remaining on the starboard side and 1 main battery turret of the German ship. The shells penetrated the destroyer's director and rangefinder. Shrapnel riddled the side and superstructure, and her speed dropped to 10 knots. An officer and 10 sailors were killed on the ship, and 11 people were wounded. Somehow, they gathered people to manage 1 torpedo launcher, and the second one was destroyed. Having fired 4 torpedoes, Somers turned away, setting a smoke screen. The available information about torpedo damage is very fragmentary. 1 torpedo exploded on the starboard side opposite the Bruno turret, jamming the horizontal and vertical guidance drives in it, as well as the main entrance hatch, so the crew could not get out on deck for a long time. The magazines began to flood. Another torpedo hit the area of the boiler room on the port side and caused some flooding. The third one hit the stern from the port side, in a place where several compartments were already flooded, and damaged the propeller shaft. The fourth torpedo hit the bow from the same side. All torpedoes had a 340 kg charge. Analyzing the damage to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau from torpedoes in previous battles, it is safe to assume that in this case there was also significant flooding of the internal spaces, It is obvious that the torpedo hit in the area of the Bruno turret was very dangerous. It caused not only a powerful blow, but also destroyed the underwater protection, leading to huge flooding. The underwater protection system in this place was especially vulnerable, not having sufficient width due to the sharp contours of the hull. The 340 kg charge of the British torpedo was enough to destroy the protection in the area of the boiler room. As a result of the torpedo hits, the speed of Scharnhorst dropped to 12 knots, although the chief engineer reported that he was ready to maintain 22 knots. Duke of York was able to close again, now at a pistol for 356mm shells, distance of 9 kilometers. She began the final shelling of the German ship, which could not respond. 2 of her bow turrets were jammed, and the third one was experiencing a shortage of shells. All available crew members worked on the transfer of ammunition from the magazines of the Bruno to the Caesar turret, which resumed fire a few minutes later, letting the British know that they would not surrender so easily. As the hull filled with water, Scharnhorst's speed dropped to 5 knots, and she barely obeyed the rudder. After the battle with Bismarck, the British realized that it was impossible to sink a large German ship with artillery alone. Therefore, Admiral Fraser ordered the cruisers to finish off Scharnhorst with torpedoes. At 7:25, Jamaica, which had previously fired 22 broadsides at the enemy, fired 2 torpedoes. 2 minutes later, Belfast fired 3 more. Then Jamaica turned, and having close to 3,500 meters, fired 3 torpedoes from the other side 10 minutes later. The hits were impossible to discern due to the smoke and fog. The cruisers left the battle arena, which was entered by the destroyers. Musketeer, having passed 900 meters from Scharnhorst, which was crawling at 3 knots, fired 4 torpedoes to the starboard side and saw 3 explosions between the funnel and the main mast. A minute later, Matchless attempted to do the same, but a huge wave, having covered the ship, damaged the aiming mechanisms of the launchers. The second wave, having flooded the breach, disabled the internal ship communication devices. Matchless had to turn back to attack with her port side. Opportune discharged one launcher at 7:30 from a range of 1900 meters, and second one later from 2300 meters. Her observers clearly saw one hit from each launch on the battlecruiser's starboard side between the mainmast and the funnel. The effect of the explosion was insignificant, since Scharnhorst was already sitting deep in the water and the torpedoes hit the main armor belt. At the same time, Virago fired 7 more torpedoes from a range of 2500 meters, also claiming 2 hits. After these attacks, the German ship practically stopped, shrouded in thick smoke and steam. Little could be seen from the English ships. A dim glow was visible, muffled explosions were heard. The veil of smoke was so dense that neither searchlight beams nor illumination shells could penetrate it. Around 7 p.m., the commander of Scharnhorst ordered all secret documents to be burned. The ship was listed to starboard and sinking by the bow. The last 150mm gun turret fired until its ammunition elevator jammed. The 20mm gun on the roof of the Bruno turret continued firing. By 7:40, the list had increased significantly, and the bow was almost underwater. All hatches and watertight doors were reinforced to contain the flooding and give the crew more time to escape. However, torpedo damage had deprived the ship of most of its buoyancy. A bright northern lights appeared over the battlefield. At 7:45, Scharnhorst sank with her bow, and the slowly rotating propellers shot from the water. A loud roar could be heard from under the water for some time. The British recorded a loud explosion before the sinking, attributing it to the exploding magazines. At 7:48, Belfast intended to carry out a second torpedo attack, but the target was lost. Matchless also did not find Scharnhorst, and together with Scorpion, began to pick up the people floundering in the icy water. Until 8:40, Belfast and Norfolk searched for survivors. Scorpion picked up 30 people, and for a time the ship's commander, Hintze, and the senior officer were seen from her. But Hintze died before help arrived, and the senior officer, although he managed to grab onto the thrown rope, was unable to climb up. He was raised already dead. Rear Admiral Eric Bay wasn't found out. Of the crew of 1,968, only 36 were saved. Hundreds of people still remained afloat, but the British received info of the German submarines approaching the battlefield, so the search was ceased and ships were ordered away. In sinking Scharnhorst, the British used 446 356mm shells, 161 203mm, 974 152mm, 531 133mm, and 83 102mm shells, as well as 55 torpedoes, of which 11 hit their target. Admiral Fraser, impressed by the heroic actions of the Germans, later in the evening praised the courage of the German crew, addressing the officers with the words, "Gentlemen, the battle against Scharnhorst has ended in victory for us. I hope that if any of you are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an opponent many times superior, you will command your ship as gallantly as Scharnhorst was commanded today." On the return journey to Scapa Flow from Murmansk, as Duke of York passed the site of the Scharnhorst demise, he ordered a wreath of chrysanthemums to be thrown into the water in memory of the German sailors who had done their military duty. Then, the cold air of the Northern Sea was torn apart by a salvo of artillery fire. The Germans explained the loss of Scharnhorst by the lack of escort destroyers and the superiority of British raiders. After the war, Admiral Karl Dönitz wrote, "The operation, undertaken by the battlecruiser Scharnhorst and a group of destroyers in December, after a successful hidden start, seemed to have every chance of success, given the enemy's disposition and weather conditions. But it failed, apparently due to an underestimation of the local situation, and Scharnhorst was lost." As we know now, the operation had no hidden beginning, since Ultra had broken the German codes. The commanders of both British battle groups were well informed about the planned movements of Scharnhorst, and could therefore prepare their own counteractions. In any case, Scharnhorst was the last Kriegsmarine ship to take offensive actions. Her destruction ended the threat posed by the German surface fleet and seriously undermined Germany's position in Norway.